Today's guest, Dr. Noseworthy, is truly a teacher in the functional medicine space and absolutely showed up in this way in this episode. He walks us through building metabolic flexibility, fasting, and even the concept of bioindividuality.
I really enjoyed the applicable practice tips he gives for solo clinicians. Also, he dives into how to critically think about tailoring fasting, exercise, and calorie goals. It's not a one size fits all, we know this, but he paints the picture so clearly using his own case studies. So, overall, a really nice, compelling mix of functional medicine topics from practice management to clinical pearls. He's humble, wise, and charismatic. It's a great one, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to your weekly dose of the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm Dr. Emmy Brown with my co-host Melissa Gentile. Today we're thrilled to have Dr. Stephen Noseworthy. With over 2 decades of experience, Dr. Noseworthy has contributed to the functional medicine space in a variety of ways. In addition to being board certified in chiropractic neurology, Dr. Noseworthy is a published scientific author, an internationally recognized speaker and educator, and developer of the autonomous health approach. Known as the doctor who teaches other doctors, Dr. Noseworthy is a leading voice on complex health conditions like thyroid dysfunction and autoimmune disorders. Get ready to be inspired as we dive deep into the world of functional medicine with Dr. Noseworthy. Dr. Stephen, how are you doing today? We're so happy to have you.
That's my pleasure. Very, very happy to be here.
Dr. Stephen, I'm so excited about today's episode. I just want to kind of dive into your background, like right off the bat. So
Sure.
Now you're in functional medicine and you have all this extensive experience, but we're just talking off air and you mentioned that you were previously in marketing and advertising. So how did that happen?
Oh gosh, it depends on how far back do you want to go?
Or where was the turning point?
Let me start by saying, like, I was never one of those teenagers, young adults who really knew what I wanted to do when I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up in business school and I had intended to actually go in on the creative side. I wanted to be a copywriter, but I ended up doing a business degree and got hired by an ad agency in Toronto as an account executive, which is the business side of things. And I had been working there for about 2 years, and I was just kind of dissatisfied. I had a shoulder problem that I'd had for several years that really limited my ability to compete in sports, to exercise the way that I wanted to. And at the time, I was referred to a chiropractic student at Canadian Memorial College, which is in Toronto. And within 3 months, he had restored 80% of the function that I had lost. And that was, for me, that was the inspiration to get out of the business world and get into the field of alternative health. And so I moved to St. Louis, went to Logan Chiropractic College, became a chiropractor. And of course, at that point, I had no designs on, of course, at that point, functional medicine didn't really exist, certainly not the way it does today. But I just thought I was going to be a chiropractor for the rest of my life. Not that I'm not a chiropractor now, but it's, that's not what I do. In fact, I haven't treated people hands-on in, oh gosh, probably close to 12 years, something like that.
Yeah, but it was like kind of like that gateway for you into that.
It was, yeah.
Whole realm.
And if you want, I can very briefly describe how I transitioned from doing chiropractic, if that you think that might be of value. And honestly, I like these origin stories.
Me too.
Right. And so it happened. It was all serendipity, maybe call it divine providence, but I had moved down to Florida and I was part of I was the clinical director of a multidisciplinary clinic. And by the time I left, I think we had 8 different practitioners of different types. We had medical doctors, nurse practitioners, a couple of chiropractors, including myself, acupuncture, so on, and all the support staff. And so I split my time between seeing patients and being the clinical director. And at that time, my job was to try to get the team together to kind of buy into a unified clinical model. And that was very hard because we all think so differently. We're all trained so differently. And so it just so happened that we had a medical doctor on staff that went to a blood chemistry analysis seminar put on by a nutraceutical company called Apex Energetics. a guy named Datis Karazian. I know a lot of people listening are going to know who Dr. K is. And I met him, and he just opened my eyes to a whole new world that I didn't even know existed. And I just kind of took to it. It lit that fire inside of me. And so I went to every seminar that he taught that I could find. And so I went from the blood chemistry course to their early version of functional endocrinology to the very first mastering brain chemistry. Um, and then and try to make a very long story not so long. We were at that mastering brain chemistry course. It was in Fort Lauderdale. And there were several practitioners from my side. I was on the Gulf Coast in the Bradenton, Sarasota area of Florida. And they knew that I had a background in neurology. And so my background in that sense is very similar to Dr. K's. And they came up to me on a break during the brain chemistry seminar and said, "Hey, when we get back home, would you put together a study group for us so that we could learn more about how the brain works?" And I thought, sure, that would be a neat thing, but I didn't really know how to do it. So I went up to Dr. K on a break and explained what they had asked me to do. And he looked me dead in the eyes and he said, "You should teach for us."
Have you
And
ever
now at this
thought
point,
about being a teacher before that?
no, it wasn't even on my radar, to be honest.
Mhm.
Just like functional medicine, nutritional medicine, whatever phrase you want to use, was never on my radar. And so I found myself in this situation. I must have looked like I had, like that deer in the headlights look, because in my head I was going, no, 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 I'm just starting out. And my mouth said, sure, that sounds great. And that was, probably late 2007. And
Mhm.
so I've been teaching for Dr. K for 16 years now. And it's been wonderful. I of all the things that I've done in my different careers, getting involved in teaching has for me probably been one of the most satisfying things. Like, it's one thing to work with people one on one, or maybe in groups if people are doing that, and to see how you can impact and change their lives. But when you're in a teaching role and you realize that, okay, I just taught 100 people, 50 people, 20 people this, and this, and I know that they're going to go out and change the lives of 100 more people, all of a sudden your impact gets completely magnified.
Mhm.
And I love the phenomenon of leading a group of people through the fundamentals of human physiology and functional medicine and clinical management, and seeing the light bulbs go off and seeing people
Mhm.
go, oh, when they connect some dots that they didn't know could be or should be connected. That to me is perhaps the most gratifying part of everything that I've done.
It's like switching from that one to one to one to many
Yeah.
instead of just like one to one consultations. Yeah.
That's so well said, Melissa. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like
And I
the
resonate
impact
with that.
is, it funnels up.
Yeah. It really is exponential, right?
Mhm.
It's and compounded year after year after year. Right. And I sometimes think about that. Like, there are doctors out there right now that over the last 10 years are doing things and helping people in ways they probably maybe would never have if we hadn't met and interacted 10 years ago.
Mhm.
So it's not just that one interaction, it's like the ongoing application of new ideas and new ways of thinking and new ways of putting data and information together and learning how to walk people through a process of, I call it crafting wellness, because that certainly doesn't happen by accident, right? It
Mhm.
has to be something that's intentional.
Well,
I
and
love
you have the autonomous health approach, which I wanna dive into later. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, kind of, yes. Like, the whole point of autonomous health, and I mean, autonomous. I mean, it's a word we have. I think most of us know what it means, but we don't use that word in everyday language
What?
all that much. You think about autonomous driving in cars; these are cars that drive themselves. So the concept of autonomous health is about teaching people, lay people who have health issues, things that they can do to take care of themselves. Like, I believe, and this is something I've said in written materials and in podcasts, I believe that for most people, 80% of what's going to help them is under their control. And that might be simple things like, discovering a better way to eat, like a better diet approach for them, or starting an exercise program when maybe they were sedentary, or crafting a better exercise program that forces different adaptations compared to what they might have been doing. So, the whole autonomous health concept is to talk to the do-it-yourselfers, um, and to give them some tools that they might not get anywhere else to empower them. And we can use all those buzzwords like empower, enrich, and educate, and all that kind of stuff, and inspire. But that's really what autonomous health is all about.
Tell us what happened. What happened in Starbucks quite some time ago?
My very first functional medicine patient I met at Starbucks. So when I mentioned earlier the multidisciplinary practice that I was in Florida, I was there for 10 years. And, just through circumstances, I decided to go out on my own. And I was supposed to be open in a new location within 3 months. And the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. And so we had delay after delay after delay. We had to find a different place. And, ultimately at the end, it was pretty much close to a year before I was actually open. So I was not working for an entire year because I had already left this other practice.
Mm.
And we had an anticipated opening date, and I started writing articles and advertising in a local health related magazine, so to speak. And so I started getting phone calls. Hey, I want to come see you. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I don't have an office yet. So I had a running list. I had a waiting list of people waiting to see me once I had an office open. And this lady called me one day, and, I told her, I said, I'd love to help you. I said, I'm like 3 weeks away or so from opening my office. And she said, I need to see you now. I'll come to your house. And I'm like, no, you won't. And she said, well, you can come to my house. I said, well, I'm not really comfortable with that. And she said, well, what can we do? And I thought, well, I just said, like, do you want to meet at Starbucks? And again, it was like no intent. I just thought I'll throw it out there. And she said, when and where?
Wow.
And so I met this lady at Starbucks, and, mind you, this was my first functional medicine client. And so I had a briefcase with me that had lab requisitions, a saliva kit, a stool kit. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know what I was going to need. And so we sat there for an hour. She bought my coffee. And at the end of the consultation, we just sat outside, beautiful sunny Florida, had a conversation for an hour. And I said, okay, I think, we need to do these labs and do whatever it is. So I started writing out a lab requisition, and she said, how much do I owe you? And I hadn't thought that far ahead. So I said the first number that popped into my head, and she pulled out a checkbook and wrote a check. And like in the back of my mind, I was thinking, wow, my practice can be anything I want it to be. And this might be a good segue into the whole virtual practice thing, because that's when I started to realize I didn't have to have a brick and mortar to help people. Now, I was already committed to, building out a nice facility, which we had for, about a year. This was literally right before the crash of 2008. And, full transparency, we lost everything. Like we were just up and running. We had invested so much money in equipment. It was a full chiropractic physical therapy rehab suite. It was a really nice place. And so the economy crashed and we lost everything, and we had to start from zero. We had to, like, quite honestly, my wife and I sat down at one point and said, all right, we got to reinvent ourselves. What are we going to do? And the first thought we both had was, do we really want a brick and mortar? Because I already had this notion that you didn't have to have that to do the kind of work that we do. Now, there's pros and cons to all of it. But over the next several years, I kind of had a mixture of, at times, mostly, if not entirely virtual. We went through a couple of years where we homeschooled our kids. And my office was upstairs right in the middle of all the kids' bedrooms. And so I would get off a call with a client. I don't even think we had, like, Zoom didn't exist. I might have been using Join Me, but most of it was just phone consultation. And I would get off the phone with a client, and there'd be a kid standing at my desk saying, Dad, I need help with math. And so and it was such a rich life because I was with my kids and my wife all the time, all day long. And I was also working and doing the kind of stuff that we love. And it just really, really kind of made me think hard about what was important to me. Because I've been in clinical situations where, we were billing and collecting a ton of money, but our overhead was as much as we were bringing in. And so we looked great on paper, and it was impressive to say, yeah, we've got an X thousand square foot facility and we've got 8 clinicians and a support team of 25 people, but we weren't making much money because the overhead was so high. And I thought, well, what if I had no overhead or very little? And that was really the genesis of what now is my current career. I should say my mode of career, which is, as I mentioned to you guys before we started recording, not just a virtual practice, but a mobile one, because we live and travel full time in the RV. And I'll let you decide if you want to go down that track at all.
We do. Absolutely.
And I just want to comment about that, about really how losing everything was kind of like a blessing in disguise for you. Because you're allowed to bring your career as more of an integration into your life, as opposed to
I wouldn't want to go back and do it any other way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could do without the heartache and the pain of losing stuff, but you only grow when you encounter and overcome difficult things, right? And we know this.
Even from a healing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And what is your, so you were transitioning into a fully virtual practice, but how did your intake process look? Like no longer seeing patients in person, and how has it changed over time?
Technology makes all the difference in the world. I started doing virtual stuff before it was cool, because everyone's doing. If someone's not doing it, they want to do it. They're trying to figure out how to do it, just because I think it's part of the fabric of practice now. I don't think that's going to go away. I think it's just going to get easier and easier and easier. So in the early days, really all you needed was a website. It didn't even have to be that good. People would find you. Now that's totally different because we have all the social media advertising, and we have algorithms that limit your visibility, and you have to, be good at that kind of stuff or hire someone who can do it. But back when I first started doing it, it was no problem for people to find me. I just had a PDF intake form that I would email to them, and they would print it out, hand fill it out, and fax or scan it or email it back to me. And then we would do our consults. Initially, it was over the phone, and then Join Me was my first one that I started using instead of Zoom. Now I use Zoom on a pretty much exclusive basis. And so even that process has changed because my EMR, my note-taking system, my scheduling system has integrated electronic forms. And so I just converted my PDFs into an electronic version. And so when I schedule a new client for their initial consultation, it handles emailing a link. They go online, they fill it out, and it gets automatically submitted and stored in their chart. And so I don't even have to do electronic filing hardly at all anymore, because it's all handled. Everything's being handled by the software behind the scenes. But it is the whole virtual practice thing is radically different now than when I first started doing it. And it's all because of the technology and software engineers and, visionaries starting to see how we can integrate different solutions to make better productivity tools.
And I want to get into interactive lab reports and how that's changed things for you. But speaking of EMR, I don't know if you just mentioned this and maybe I missed it. Which one are you using right now?
I use it used to be called My Practice. Now it's called Simple or Simplified Practice. Simple or Simplified Practice. I don't pay attention to it because I've had it for 10 years or so.
Well, and that speaks volumes. I just think listeners would be curious, if they're trying to
if you've been in practice and you've used electronic systems, there is no perfect system.
Of course.
And the systems are typically designed from the perspective of the person who's driving that creation process. And they have their way of thinking, their way of doing things. And it may match mine, may not. I was fortunate enough to provide some feedback to this company early on that they implemented. And in fact, it's, some of it has been not complete overhauls, but redesigns of their interface and being able to get from here to here very easily and very quickly without having to go through multiple stops. And so some of the, not all, but some of the functionality that that system has now is a direct result of me giving them feedback and saying, hey, I would like to be able to do this. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. And so it's always nice when you have companies, whether it's a lab like you guys or a software company that's willing to listen to their users. And I know you can't listen just to one voice. Just because one person has one idea doesn't mean you implement it. But
Hey, it might
if
be
it
it
makes sense,
might be the best idea, even if it's just
or it
one.
might, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes that's all you need. But certainly when you hear the same thing being said by different people, it's a lot easier to go, okay, let's go back and replan and reformulate.
Yeah. And the fact that it integrates their intake into their chart,
Yeah.
that's impressive. I don't know if I've seen that before. And that
Yeah.
sounds great.
Yeah. I think there are
Awesome.
many systems that do that, but that is the way of the future, right? It's to have the flexible systems that allow individual doctors to not just use stock intake forms, but to basically create an electronic version of what they have always used.
Mhm.
And I think that's the way it should be done. Um, there's the standard things that we all learn in school about how to take a history and the elements that go into the history, and that's pretty much uniform across all disciplines. But we all have our own take. Like we have I have questions that I like to ask in my intake form that other people don't ask at all because their clinical model is different than mine.
Mhm.
Or maybe they ask it during conversation. Like they just didn't think, hey, I should probably put that on my intake form. They're used to asking it. And I'm a huge fan of anything I say over and over again in a conversation, like in an intake. I want that now on my form because I can collect it automatically. And they use the conversation time to dig deeper for other things. That's at
Sure.
least the way that I think.
Well said. So can you give us a couple examples of what's on your intake that might not be on other providers?
Oh gosh, I don't know because I mean at this point I don't know what other people are doing. Um, I have an entire section of my intake form that is designed to give me insight into some details of lifestyle, but maybe more importantly, a lot of companies and people use kind of functionally oriented review of systems, right? Some people
Mhm.
might, in our world, in the Apex system, we call it the metabolic assessment form, and I've taken that and just basically put it on steroids. And so I have sections of questions that are designed early on to clue me into whether or not I'm dealing with a problem with say blood flow and perfusion, or if I'm dealing
Yeah.
with some kind of a dysglycemia, or if I have a problem
Mhm.
with nitric oxide. And none of this is diagnostic, but it's all indicative. We use that to kind of create a mosaic and a picture that then helps to drive questioning during the intake process and drive the diagnostic plan,
Mhm.
right? And ideally, that would be slightly different for every person that we deal with. Um, and so I can't think of specific examples off the top of my head, but that's probably for me as a clinician, one of the better decisions I made was to digitize that part of my intake form.
Mhm.
And I'm always it's not just questions that I ask myself or ask patients when I'm doing my initial consultation. It's questions that I'm asking myself when I'm reviewing, say, their initial lab work. Like I'll look and you and I both know that numbers are one thing, but in the absence of their clinical context and history, numbers don't really mean much,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And here's an example. Like for years in blood chemistry analysis, people would teach that, if their blood sugar was say below 85, that was a problem. They were reactive hypoglycemic.
Hmm.
Well, that's not necessarily true because we have all kinds of very well conditioned people who are on low carb and fat adapted diets. They have metabolic flexibility and
Right.
their glucose is 79 and they're asymptomatic and very functional. So the numbers by themselves only mean so much without the context of real life.
Of course, you need to have that clinical correlation. Always.
Exactly. And yeah, and so what I ended up doing over the years was really simply adding more layers, more depth and detail to my intake form so that by the time I looked at their intake form, looked at this, call it a functional review of systems, call it whatever you want. Um, the whole point of the consultation is and the intake form is to have an idea of what you're dealing with before you even suggest what the labs are. Like if you're using labs, this is a general truism, always exceptions. But if somebody is clinically using labs to figure something out because they have no clue what they're dealing with, they're not doing a good job of their intake process, in my opinion. And I don't say that to offend anyone, because that was me at one point, right? Back when I knew very little. But going back to the big picture, I have tried very hard over the years to make my job easier. And sometimes that means bigger and more detailed intake and more sophisticated diagnostics, right?
And it
More than
has
just
to
a,
be with
yeah,
a virtual
I think
practice.
so. I think so. It does.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering, Dr. Stephen, how do you get around the physical, the lack thereof physical exam with a virtual practice? Are you having patients send in videos or pictures of rashes or whatever? If there's a
Sometimes.
heat
Yeah.
issue, I'm thinking about neurology or a tremor.
Yeah.
Or, I'm sure you pick up a lot of this stuff just face to face.
Yeah. I mean,
But
even just looking at you guys, I can do, visual inspection of posture and
oh gosh,
muscle
I know.
tone
I'm
in your
like, I
face.
gotta
So it was like,
let
okay,
me
now I got to
just.
straighten up. Yeah.
what
I
up?
mean,
What up? Shoulders?
but of course it's limited, right? And so there are trade-offs with everything. I would think that if there's one thing that I miss about having a brick and mortar, it's the functional neurology stuff, which
Mhm.
there are some things that you can do just in a visual consultation like this. I mean, I could say, okay, Emmy, I want you to, stand up and back up, and I want you to march in place and then close your eyes, or we could test your balance, and I can
Sure.
watch you do that.
Right.
But there's a lot of stuff that you can't do in a virtual consult that you have to be face to face and, hands on, so to speak. And so I do miss that part of it, but I don't miss it enough to stop traveling around the continent and
Yeah, that's
still
a
be able
I know
to
that.
see the
really nice,
clients.
nice trade-off there.
Yeah,
And
for
you're in the
sure.
RV right now as we speak,
I
correct?
am. Yes.
No.
I
Yeah.
I
love
like
that.
to paint that picture for our listeners. I think
Yeah.
that's inspiring. Very cool.
Yeah. And Dr. Stephen, I
Yeah.
do want to deep dive a little bit into autoimmunity. I know it's like
Mhm.
a big topic that you touch on, and I feel like autoimmune disease, it's like it feels like an epidemic in our world right now. And where are you seeing these conditions start? Like when you're looking at an intake and you're meeting with
Yeah.
a new consult, like what are some of the things you're picking up on?
Yeah. Well, I honestly, I think I could go in a couple of different directions with that question. Let me say this. There was just this past weekend, there was a symposium in Omaha on mental health, and I was fortunate enough to have a 2-hour slot to teach on the neuroendocrine immunology of anxiety and depression. And I asked the group, it was, I don't know, maybe 150 docs or so. I asked them, how many of you have been in practice, say, more than 10 years? And a lot of people put their hands up. And I said, are the people that you're dealing with now, are the cases you're dealing with now different than when we were 10, 15 years ago? And everyone's like, oh, absolutely. And that's been my experience, is that, and maybe it was because I didn't know what to look for. That's possible, right? You don't know what you don't know. And I certainly I would like to think that I know a lot more now than I did when I first started doing this. But nevertheless, it seems to be kind of a global experience in our community that the people we're dealing with are, on one hand, their problems are more complex.
Mhm.
They have more complaints. I call it multiple symptoms in multiple systems. Pretty much everything is going on. But on the flip side, a lot of them are so much more educated and aware than they were in the past. And that's obviously thanks to things like podcasts and social media and YouTube and summits and all this kind of stuff. But what strikes me is that despite the the increased knowledge base of the average person who comes to see me, like they know a lot more than my new clients, say 15 years ago, they're still not really better equipped to help themselves. And
What?
this
Why is
is,
that?
when I teach seminars, if I'm teaching a full weekend seminar, I'm very fond of starting out by saying, the smarter I get, the dumber I feel.
Same.
I completely agree
Right?
with you there. It's like the more you
Yeah.
know, the more you realize you actually don't know.
That's right, right, and
It just
sometimes it's,
opens
like,
up. Yeah.
ridiculous. It just kinda gets to the point where I'm like, "Gosh, this is so," forgive my language, "freaking complex."
Hmm.
How am I ever gonna figure this
Absolutely.
out? And there's always like, you get to a point where you think, "Okay, I've mastered this pathway, I've mastered this problem," and then all of a sudden, someone else says, "Hey, did you hear about this?" or "What do you know about that?" And I'm like, "Gosh, I've never even heard of that." And
Yeah.
and then
Daily
you're like
vapor.
and then you feel like an idiot, right? But and so I think that part of the problem is that, gosh, and we're kind of trending into a separate discussion, which is trying to look at things from the patient standpoint, because now they're in a world full of social media, biohackers, internet experts, and they're learning
Never
so
ending.
much.
Hmm.
It's never ending, and I think there's some utility to it, but I think there's a real danger. Well, danger is probably a strong word, but I think there's definitely a downside to it. But I think that going back to the main question of autoimmunity, like what has changed?
Mhm.
Well, I think that if you look at the literature, it's very clear that most cases, not all, because there are mechanisms like bystander mechanisms, for example, that or collateral damage mechanisms where someone can acquire an autoimmunity without having a genetic predisposition. But for the most part, the thought now, and has been for a while, is that people either are or are not predisposed to certain types of autoimmune diseases. And that is generally necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to trigger the autoimmunity. At some point, you have to have a sufficient trigger, which can come either from the internal or the external environment. And so the onset and the perpetuation of autoimmunity is really an interplay between genetic predisposition, diet, lifestyle, and environmental influences. That's what the literature says, right?
Hmm.
And that to me comports with what I see in clinical practice. Because if those are the mechanisms, then what happens if we change that? What happens if we change someone's diet? And we've all had cases where all we did was put someone on a gluten-free diet and all of a sudden their Hashimoto's is under control, right? We have
Yeah.
we have published case studies in the field of neurology where um, gluten sensitivity causes white matter changes in the brain, mimicking neurological autoimmune disease, and going gluten free resolves the MRI findings, like within a matter of say 6 months.
Wow.
Astounding.
And it is, but and it's I think it's really just a testimony to how amazing the intelligent design of the human body is. I mean, it's nothing like if I put someone on a gluten free diet and it radically changes their health, that's not me, right? I'm just the smart guy who said, "Hey, maybe you should try going gluten free." But nevertheless, like if you, and this kind of speaks to the whole clinical model question, like what is it? Why is it helpful? Like if you understand the underlying mechanisms, the framework of autoimmune disease, then it should lead into some kind of a clinical thought process and a clinical approach that then informs your diagnostic strategy and then the practical applications of what you do once you get that information, right? And so, as a general rule, in our world, we're dealing with diet, lifestyle, nutritional supplementation. Now, my opinion, and I'll ask your opinion on this, it seems to me that functional medicine has really it's kind of been dominated by a supplement centric approach.
Yes, I completely agree. It's like we're just swapping out
Yeah,
a pharmaceutical for a nutraceutical, and it's like that's not the full picture. That's just 1%.
that's 1%, and this was like it was an uncomfortable realization I came to myself many years ago. Was like I'm not paying enough attention to people's diets.
Mm.
And so then you go through kind of an evolution of, okay, well, I'm going to recommend the paleo diet to everybody. And then, the newest fad comes in and I get distracted by that. And now you're off to the paleo autoimmune diet, which is a little bit
Mhm.
more restrictive and so on. But, nevertheless, it's like, this is, I think, part of the maturation of a functional medicine clinician is coming face to face with your own shortcomings. Like, how do you become a better clinician? Well, getting better at the things you already know is one way to do that. But the best way to do that is to figure out what you don't know that you don't know.
Yeah.
or to gain expertise in other areas that you know are important, but you just simply haven't prioritized. And that was me many years ago, like again with the diet piece. And, probably more recently in the last several years, the lifestyle piece, particularly with exercise, has become increasingly more important. So I find myself in my clinical programming now doing less with supplements and doing more with detailed dietary guidance. And that's a process.
Mhm.
And delving into things like exercise tolerance and really looking at someone's activity and exercise plan. And and, and and there's kind of different avatars in that space. Like you have the person who's really never exercised their life, but we know they should. They know they should. So how do you take someone who has, for example, I've got two ladies I'm working with right now in different parts of the country that are both neuro Lyme cases, right? They've got Lyme, they're kind of post chronic Lyme, but they've got neurological autoimmunity. And thank you to Vibrant testing, that's how I identified that. And and both of them were severely exercise intolerant. Like just the slightest amount of activity was too much for them, and they would be down for days if they did too much. And sometimes too much is I did laundry today, right? That can be the extreme of it. Sometimes it's I just did too much in the gym, but it's taking me longer to recover. But both of these ladies, their exercise tolerance was severely compromised. And so on one hand, we know, gosh, exercise is such an important part of health and wellness and longevity, but they're not tolerant to activity. So how do we get them into an activity program that's designed to meet them where they are, push their boundaries just enough to get their system to begin to adapt without sacrificing their ability to recover and come back and continue to do it with some frequency that's going to drive those adaptations over time.
And I do
And
have
and
to
I
ask, is
yeah,
there I'm just asking interested because you brought up two women as examples. Are there any like personality types or personas that kind of attract these diseases or just kind of are a target, more what women versus men or
Especially
type A?
autoimmunity.
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know if this answers your question, Melissa, but I know in the literature there's some theories that autoimmunity tends to affect women more than men simply because of the different hormonal profiles. And if we start looking into the whole realm of neuroendocrine immunology, right? And I'll just go through the spiel that I normally do in seminars is that like if I show you the front and the back of my hand, you don't get confused thinking those are two different things. But we look at the immune system as if it's in its own bubble, right? But what we do know is that the brain makes hormones. It has cytokine receptors. The brain influences immunocompetence, and it's all interrelated. And so when you're dealing with immunocompromised people, for whether it's Lyme or autoimmunity or COVID or anything like that, hormones have to be involved, right? You can't shift one without the other. And the immune system, the brain, they're all inseparable. Even though I would argue that the brain is kind of the master control, I don't think you can have a sensible conversation about whether it's the brain, the hormones, or the immune system, especially in complex and chronic illness. I don't think you can have a sensible conversation of one of those things without considering the others. And so my opinion is that the lens that all of us should be using in functional medicine to look at someone's case and ask, what's going on and how do we identify the mechanism? What do we do about it? I think it has to be through the lens of neuroendocrine immunology. I think it's the only thing that makes sense. Otherwise, you're intentionally blinding yourself to very large aspects of the control system of their core functions.
I think that speaks to maybe patterns you're seeing on labs, Dr. Steven. I'm wondering when you're looking at hormones, you're looking at sex hormones, thyroid hormones, you're looking at maybe some cytokines. It's popular with some
Yeah.
providers, not so much with others. So looking at patterns on lab work, But also I'm wondering from a psychological standpoint, personality types. Sometimes we hear about type A, and this is very subjective, so we're
Yeah.
getting kind of away from the scientific aspect a bit, but type A females being more prone to autoimmunity. Have you seen that just in your experience? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think I'm going to claim I don't know. Um,
Mm.
I see what I see and I don't see what you see, and vice versa. I
Right. We
can't
all look at
say
different things based on interest.
exactly. And even though I really don't do any marketing. Um, there seems to be a certain type that seeks me out for whatever reason.
We
And I
all have
don't
that
know.
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I see a lot of most of my clients are women, but and over the years I have more men clients than I ever have, but still most of my clients are women. But it's very common. Like there are certain themes that I do tend to see. One is almost to a person, they're hypocaloric. They're just not eating enough food.
That's hugely valuable to hear
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
and
so
and I
many.
would say, like, if I were advertising to, find people with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, et cetera, I'd have a lot more. But I have, and I think part of it, I'm not quite decided on this yet, but I think part of it is how loud the drums have been beating over the last several years about things like calorie restriction and intermittent fasting for longevity.
Ooh,
Mm,
that's a really
And then
good,
and
yeah.
I
yeah, and then there's always
We're getting
there's
into the good stuff
always
now. Yeah.
there's always that fear of, I'm getting older and I can't lose weight, so I'm going to eat fewer calories and
sure.
yada
Mhm.
yada yada. But it seems to me that um, fuel sufficiency, like if you look, I just mentioned neuroendocrine immunology. If you look at just the concept of what does being hypocaloric do for somebody? Well, in the short term, it can be quite advantageous, right? You can even get into things like modified, like the Prolon, Victor Longo's work, and the fasting mimicking diet. We're eating 800 calories a day, or Maria Emmerich's protein sparing fasting modified diet. And, there's different versions of this whole approach. But we do know that short term calorie restriction can be quite beneficial. Long term calorie restriction is not,
Mhm.
right? Your system needs a certain amount of fuel to run everything. And we do know from research that prolonged significant calorie restriction downregulates basal metabolism. And so what was once a calorie restriction, say 1200 calories a day, now is your basal metabolism. And so you eat less and less and your metabolism continues to modify itself, mostly because of hypothalamic set points. And all of a sudden, what was a calorie deficit no longer is, because everything has slowed down. But if you ask the question, what is the impact of being hypocaloric and being in a low fuel state on the brain? The answer is everything bad,
Mhm.
right? The brain is the most metabolically sensitive system we have, so much so that neurons in the paraventricular nucleus and the hypothalamus are constantly sampling their own glucose levels, their own thyroid levels, their own progesterone levels, and making decisions for the entire system. And when you deprive a neuron of fuel and it can't adapt to that, because there are adaptive kind of backup systems to maintain fuel sufficiency. But when those backup systems don't work well and you're not feeding yourself enough throughout the day with your dietary choices, neurons enter into states of dysfunction and over very long periods of time start to degenerate.
I do have a
So
question
hypocal
there about
yeah.
that. Just because you mentioned the brain, what do you say to the people who are fasting, or maybe they're following a ketogenic diet because they want the benefits of the ketones? They want to feel sharp.
Yeah.
They want to feel focused.
And
So
you
what
said
do I
long
say to
term.
them in what sense? I think I missed the question.
Just kind of like, just kind of on the contrary. Like, do you think there's still some mental benefits to it?
I think that if you asked me what is the best diet for the brain, I would say hands down keto diet.
Okay. So
I,
this
I
can
do
kind of
believe
go,
that. And,
yeah.
and, and I do think the literature bears that out as well. I think
Mhm.
I think, but I think maybe what's underneath your question, if I can presume, is, what happens when people go low carb, they restrict their calories, or maybe they try to go keto and they fall apart, right? Because we probably all know people who have gone keto and they're like, this is the most, I've never felt better. Like they may have had a couple of rough days, but they adapt and all of a sudden their brain is clear, they're sharp, they're energetic, they don't have cravings, their moods are stable, they sleep well, they start losing weight. But that's not the experience for everyone. And so the question is, well, what's the difference? And yeah, you can account for maybe they're not doing it right, but let's just put that off to the side for the moment. If you have someone, and this is the way I do things clinically myself, and this is actually, I'm thinking this is part of my intake questionnaire. If you have somebody who has tried fasting or ketogenic diet, and or they show even a moderate reactive hypoglycemic symptom picture, like getting hangry if they don't eat, by definition, that person has lost metabolic flexibility, right? Metabolic flexibility implies that I can efficiently use glucose or fat or ketones as a fuel source. I can slip in and out just depending on my need and the demand. And the people who don't tolerate low calorie, low carb, ketogenic diets that have reactive hypoglycemia, they don't have metabolic flexibility. And in my opinion, you must help them develop that.
And now, whether how do you develop that? Like when you do have those cases?
Slowly. Slowly. So I think there's several different things to consider, but let me just focus in on one. And again, this is how I do it. Years ago, I kind of formulated an idea. I call it the carbohydrate sweet spot.
Ooh.
I'll give you a couple of examples clinically. The carbohydrate sweet spot to me seems to be between 75 and 125 grams per day. And that's still the middle to the upper end of what we call low carb. Right? Most people would say low carb is 130 grams or below. And so for the people who demonstrate this intolerance to lower calories, low carb ketogenic diets, and again, most of them have some degree of reactive hypoglycemic symptoms, what I like to do is have them, we set their carbohydrate intake somewhere in that carbohydrate sweet spot. Let's say we start at the top at 125 grams per day. And we let them run that diet with other macro prescriptions, if you want to call it that. We, kind of lay out calories. How do we parcel that out between protein, fat, carbohydrates? I might start them out at 125 grams per day. We'll do that for 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll kind of check in and say, how are you doing? How's your brain? How's your energy? How's your sleep? Do you have cravings? Is your mood stable? And if the answer is I'm doing pretty well, then we'll drop down by 25 grams and go to 100. And we'll see how they're due. And if they're doing okay, we'll stay there for a few weeks. And then we'll try to go from 100 to 75. And we'll keep marching down in 25 gram per day increments until we either get into ketosis or they destabilize. And by destabilizing, and let's just pick simple numbers, we start at 100 and they're doing okay. Let's say we go to 75 grams of carbs per day, and all of a sudden they can't think and they're tired and they get crabby. Well, we go back to 100 grams because their flexibility does not allow them to go below that. They are dependent upon carbohydrates. And again, I don't care. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't care if someone runs a glucose-dependent lifestyle or a fat-dependent one, as long as they're healthy and well, and as long as they have the ability to switch at any time and do well. What I don't like is when you're forced into one versus the other. And so it's kind of like and again, in my opinion, unless you are heavily muscled and you're using those muscles very frequently in activities that require your glycolytic pathways, like your anaerobic type energy systems, I don't think anybody needs to be eating more than 125 grams of carbs per day. But the average, what's the average American intake was what, 275, 300 plus.
Wow.
And they're sedentary. And we're wondering, like, where's this obesity and diabetes epidemic coming from? It's like, well, like where do you think it's coming from? It's actually quite simple if you understand the pathways and and human metabolism. It's quite clear. So that's how I do it. I do it slowly. And let me give you an example of this. I'll tell you the case where I first started thinking this way. I was working with a young guy. I think at the time he was in his late 20s, early 30s. He worked in financial management. So he used his brain all day long. And he was kind of had this engineering mindset, right? He thought through everything, was a great critical thinker, problem solver. This was back when podcasts and, easy access to information about health and wellness first started to become a thing. And he was very well read. He understood a lot of different things. And he himself had become convinced that low carb was the way to go. And he was at the time eating, I think it was 50 grams. He wasn't in ketosis. He was right at about 50 grams of carbs, but he still couldn't manage more than 2, maybe 3 hours of work before his brain just shut down. Mm. And so I ended up writing a letter to his employer saying, hey, we're dealing with some issues. We'll fix it. We'll sort it out. But I don't want James to work more than 3 hours at a time, and then he needs to go home. And so I finally convinced him, because we did pretty much everything else that I could think of, because he was very clear. He didn't want me to mess with his carb intake. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll come back to it if we need to. And so we set about doing a whole bunch of other things over a period of months. And he was still, like a lot of other things, gut symptoms got better. H. pylori went away, yada, yada, yada. But his brain wasn't working still. And so I said, I think we have to go back to, let's try some higher carbs. We went back and forth, and I finally convinced. And so we said, let's go up in 25 gram income. So we went from 50 to 75, no change. Did that for a few weeks. And I said, okay, let's go to 100, no change. And I said, okay, let's go to 115. And then boom, his brain starts working. And I'm like, well, this is crazy. But what it told me was that he was dependent on carbohydrates. And I'm like, in my earlier days, I would have just been happy. Okay, for the rest of your life, you eat 115 grams of carbs. But then I started thinking clinically, that's not good. Like if you have to eat carbohydrates to function, that's a problem. So that was one case. And I'll tell you one more, and I'm sure we either need to end. I'm okay to keep talking if you guys want to keep talking.
No, I think this is great. Yeah, this is really, really good information.
Real quick.
Yes, please.
Or just real quick, Dr. Stephen, on that case, what about the exercise component? Was he doing strength training?
He was. He was quite lean. He was lightly muscled. He had an appropriate muscle mass for his frame. And he wasn't, he was doing well. But I was, I'm thinking back, there was also a time where, even though I myself was active, I wasn't basically requiring my clients to engage in that. That was back early in my career when I was more focused on running labs and figuring out what supplements to give somebody. So I'll share another case, and I'll try to do this quickly. Back when I did have a brick and mortar, we had moved into the Tampa Bay area, and I got an office. I had that for about 2 years, and I would go in maybe 2-3 days a week. And so I had another doctor. I had a bunch of doctors that were referring cases to me to do neurological evaluations. And it was usually functional medicine doctors. They would handle the func med, and I would handle the neurology stuff. And so this lady comes in, her husband pushes her in a wheelchair, and she's this tiny little thing, probably 5'5". If she weighed 95 pounds, it was probably it, but she had MS. And she hadn't been out of her wheelchair in, I think it was 6 months. I'm probably off on that, but just to paint the story. And so we went through standard intake. I did a neuro exam, and we got some labs back, or I reviewed the labs that the other doctor had said, and it was clear that she had some reactive hypoglycemia. And I said, okay, I want you to, based on my calculations, you need something like 1,100 calories per day, something like that, because she's small, frail, no activity. And so I asked her how much she eats. And she said, well, doc, I eat all day long. I'm eating constantly. And her husband said, yeah, that's true. Like, she's always eating. And I said, well, give me an example. And she said, well, I'll eat 3 strawberries and I'll get full.
Okay.
So in her mind, she was eating all the time, but she would eat very small, very low calorie things. I'll eat a quarter cup of green beans and I'll get full. So I had her do a diet diary, and on average, she was eating 400 calories a day.
Wow.
I'm like, okay, this has got to change. Long story short, um, when her calories got up to 900, she got out of her wheelchair.
And even
Now,
at 900, that's still so low
it
too.
was still suboptimal.
I'm thinking like,
but I think what it should highlight for us is the absolute requirement neurologically, not just neurologically, but all systems, for energy sufficiency. Right. And so we have this big picture question: are you eating enough calories? Period. Like that is a must. In my world, you have to be eating enough food. And now enough food is going to be dependent on what your goals are and what your current body status is. Your muscle mass, your extra body fat, and all those different variables that go into it. But going back to my observation that, at least in my practice, most of the chronically ill people, with or without autoimmunity, across the board, they're hypocaloric. And that is a big contributor, because when you don't have fuel to run your core systems, you cannot sustain immune competence. It does not work, right? So you have to fuel the system for the system to work. And, when I started thinking this way, I'm like, it was one of those like, oh gosh, how could I have been so stupid for so many years? But like many other practitioners, I had been seduced into this clinical model of functional medicine is all about running tests to figure out what supplements to give people. And if that's all I'm doing, then I'm doing functional medicine. And I would argue, no, you're not. You're doing part of functional medicine. There's so much more to that.
I like that you're bringing kind of like a different narrative to light here, because like you said, there's really been this big push for more fasting, more caloric restriction. But there's definitely a flip side to it, that's maybe not as talked about. So thank you.
And
thank you.
That is like, when I was looking over the questions that you guys had sent as just an idea and an outline, one of the questions was global trends. And I was like, well, I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that. And I started thinking like, gosh, that's not true, because I think one of the big global trends is in, the biohacking movement. And I have a love-hate relationship with that. The biohackers, all the influencers, the internet and social media has given a platform to anybody to say anything. And most people cannot discern the good, the bad from the ugly, right? They just they don't have it. And I would say the biggest problem that I have with the whole biohacking thing is the lack of clinical experience. Right? It's you don't have to be a rocket science to understand basic biochemistry. A lot of people do. In fact, there's a lot of people in this movement, a lot of social media influencers that maybe have PhDs in nutrition or biochemistry, but they don't see people. And that's the missing piece. And so I'll cringe because I'll hear somebody who has some credentials, who has a big internet following, say something that's just frankly untrue. Like, that is not correct. Like that is just wrong, and it's demonstrably wrong. And then they'll say things that are maybe consistent with population data, like over thousands and tens of thousands of people, this is the general trend, but they speak about that one thing as if it's true for every individual person. And the person who's listening tends to interpret it that way. Like, oh, I should be doing OMAD, right? OMAD is the answer. 1 meal a day. Or my fasting window has got to be, if it's not 18 hours, I'm not getting into autophagy. I'm like, no, that's not right.
There's an art piece to it, for just on a bio individual level.
I have found myself in the recent past saying that the art of what we do meets the science when we're dealing with individual people.
Ooh, I love that.
Right? You can quote me on that.
Yeah.
But I really think that that's how it, because I do recognize, like, I love to be science guided and science minded, but I do things in my practice that I can't point to any science as to why this works. I know it does. in many cases, right? And you discern which ones are appropriate. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that I only do things that are based on, double blind, placebo, crossover controlled randomized trials.
Mm.
I would never suggest that that's the only reason why I implement some kind of clinical or diagnostic strategy. There's a lot of what I do that it's just a result of having done this for so many years, and you see what works and what doesn't.
It's clinical
And then
experience.
that's right. And
Yeah.
that is perhaps my biggest problem
Yeah.
with all these non-clinician influencers.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
I hear ya.
having said that, have I learned things from people out there who have a background different than I do, delving into areas that I haven't bothered to look at? Of course I have. I would be silly to say that I've learned nothing listening to, whether it's a Dave Asprey or Thomas DeLauer or Lane Norton. I've learned things from all of them, but none of them are clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is part of the frustration on the side of healthcare consumers. Going back, Melissa, to that question of why is it that people are smarter, better educated, but still unable to help themselves, is because that's the bridging piece. It's the art of this whole thing. It's not just about knowing what a study says about a certain problem and what might help. How do you know if it does or if it's even appropriate for you? Like, I feel like I can look at someone's history, look at their intake form, certainly look at their labs, and say intermittent fasting is not for you right now. Don't do it. I feel like I'm at that point. And not to make this whole conversation about things like intermittent fasting, that's just one facet, but it's a very important one simply because it fits into how do you find someone's ideal diet strategy? Because fasting is not right for everyone when they come to see you. That's my opinion.
Well, it's all those pieces that the folks, the health-minded people, well-intentioned people,
Yeah.
they're not getting those pieces of the history, of the labs, of the family history, of the physical exam, whatever you can observe, right? They're only maybe looking at the research, if that.
Yes.
Which is still
Yeah.
valuable in and of itself, but
Well, it certainly is. And then, the other element, if I can add to that, is being able to work with someone over a period of time to see how they respond to different choices.
Right, of course.
Right. Because I mean, the way that I work is if I take on a new client, it's usually at least for 5-6 months. Like, I typically won't work with someone who wants to work for 3 months. I'm like, that's not enough in most cases. But it's maybe it's the type of cases that I work on. Like, I've learned 3 months is just not enough time. It's going to take me a month to get all the data, right? Because labs don't, to run a lab and get the results, it takes a month. And so 1 out of 3 is gone. And so, you learn so much in the first 2 to 3 months of working with someone when you're changing their diet and you're looking at different options and strategies. And also when you're having them employ different lifestyle strategies. Like, what if you say, hey, Mrs. Jones, I want you to go exercise, but you don't know what their metabolic tipping point is. You don't know what their VO2 max is. You don't know what their exercise tolerance is. And they get blown out of the water because they go and think, okay, well, that means I have to join Orange Theory Fitness. And now I'm working out at 85% of my theoretical max heart rate. And they can't handle that metabolic.
0 to 60.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of a sudden now you've got to spend 2 or 3 weeks getting back to where you were. Right. And so I think there's so much value in a clinical model that is based on a programmatic approach, where even though you don't have all the answers, I tell my new clients all the time, like, what we're doing is it's a flexible framework. Like, I can see maybe 4, 5, 6 months down the road, and I think we're going to do this first, then we're going to move to this, and then we're going to move to that. That's my plan. But I'm willing to change anything along the way based on how you're responding to the things that we're doing. And so it's a flexible framework. And I think that it's clinically foolhardy to engage particularly with complex people without having some kind of a semi-structured plan. Going visit to visit, that's what they do in the medical world. And we're trying to solve some of those problems, right? Sure. Longer visits, more time, personal touch, foresight. Don't get me started.
Flexibility too, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
for
willingness to
sure.
change the plan
Yes,
depending on the
exactly.
results. Absolutely.
Exactly.
A lot of food for thought.
Well, Dr. Steven, I feel like we could go on for hours. I feel like I could ask 57 more questions for you today, but we won't take
I'll
up
be happy to
too.
come back. If you guys want to have me back, I'll be happy to
Yes,
come back.
please. We would love that. But I do like to end every episode on a really positive note. I'd like to ask, all of our providers, like, what does it mean to you to live a vibrant life?
Oh, I see what you did there.
Just to kind of flip the script.
Yeah, there's that coming from the marketing expert.
Mm.
You know, we didn't really delve much into where we are, my wife and I, living and traveling full time in the RV, having a virtual practice that's mobile. And, for me, it was born out of partly a little bit of a dream, but somewhat out of necessity. That's a longer story. And part of it is a little bit of downer because it involves loss of loved ones and all this kind of stuff. I think a vibrant life is first and foremost marked with a sense of community, being part of something bigger than yourself, and feeling that you were loved, and loving people that are close to you. But that's not enough. I think that we have to be biochemically whole. We have to engage in our environment. We have to move our bodies. We have to protect our brain. I mean, gosh, like we could do a whole podcast just on that question. Like vibrance it's firing on all cylinders and feeling that if you're not fulfilled, you're pursuing that in every aspect of your life. And I do think that is much harder when you're unhealthy and you're unwell.
Yeah, you can't show up in the same way or serve others in the same
can't.
way. Yeah.
Back during that period of time when I was waiting for my practice to open, when I left the group to go out on my own, I wrote an article about what I call the mom syndrome. And the mom syndrome is where a mother puts everyone's else needs ahead of her own for decades and finds herself in her 40s, maybe 50s, and she didn't know what happened to her, and she's so unhealthy. And, we usually have a conversation, and that one article got so many people contacting me because I think what ends up happening is that in order to be the best mother, father, husband, wife, brother, sister, employee, entrepreneur, neighbor, the best person you can be, you have to be healthy. Now, it begs the question, what does that mean? But I don't think, like you said, you can't show up the way that you need to show up if you're not well, if you're not vibrant.
Absolutely.
I'll leave it there.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I love the message. And Dr. Noseworthy, where can our listeners find you if they want to connect with you or be a patient?
Yeah, so my easiest way is my website. It's just simply drnoseworthy, drnoseworthy.com, and I'm sure you'll put up some links. I should mention that I have a couple of podcasts on my own. One is for the public, and that is called Inflammation Nation. And then I have one for practitioners called Funk Med Nation that I started last year that I'm planning on ramping up quite a bit more this year and the coming months. And in the Funk Med Nation, I'm having conversations with researchers and experts in the field. I want to talk to the people who give the information that we use clinically, right? And because that's a whole world that we don't understand as clinicians. We don't understand research. And so I want to talk to the people who are doing the research that affect what the decisions we make. And the Inflammation Nation, which is for the public, is just really an ongoing conversation of all the different aspects of health, wellness, functional medicine. I have a lot of practitioners that follow me on that one because I end up talking about functional medicine and labs and clinical models and all that kind of stuff along the way. So that's how people can follow me. Social media, I'm an intermittent poster, but the podcast is
in
my
a
main
written
focus.
poster. Love that term.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be sure for anyone listening here today, we'll make sure we link everything in the show notes for you guys so you can follow Dr. Stephen Noseworthy. I know you got some courses up on your website too, so be sure to check those out. But thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. You're really helping us kind of offer so much value to our audience. And I feel like we were able to kind of open up the conversation into so many areas that we haven't really gone into deeply on the podcast yet. So appreciate your time. Would love to have you back sometime. And to everyone listening and tuning in today, thank you and wishing you all vibrant health and wellness.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guest and host are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.